All right. I think we are live. Well, welcome to everyone who is here today. And I'm sure a few other people will be joining us. Let me just start by saying thank you to Pastor Yolanda Oliver and to Pastor McCullough at St. Mark United Methodist Church for allowing us to host this evening's broadcast through your Ignite social media platform. We're definitely pleased to have St. Mark a part of the community, helping us today, but have served the community so diligently for several years. Northeast community of Wichita, Kansas. Also, special thanks to Humanities Kansas for trusting in us to complete a film on such a delicate yet worthwhile subject as this 1965 plane crash. Finally, we want to thank each of you for tuning in and sharing with us this evening. We hope you enjoyed the film. Going to get right into it in just a second, but I want to take a couple minutes to introduce our panel guest this evening, and then we'll start the film, followed by a brief Q&A with the guests following the credits. That said, I have Ricardo Harris here with me. He's also one of the co-directors of the film and one of the cinematographers and editors. Ken Hawkins is not with us. He may be joining us. He is also serving in that same capacity that Ricardo did. And on behalf of myself, Ken, and Ricardo, I want to welcome, first of all, Mr. Victor Daniels. Mr. Daniels is a native of Wichita, a community servant who has volunteered with several organizations, including Real Men, Real Heroes. He also holds degrees and certificates in computer science, technical design, and digital media. And he's an avid photographer. And he also is experimenting with aerial photography with drones as well. He's here with us today because several of his family members, including his father and grandmother, lost their lives during the plane crash. And he's here to share some of his powerful perspectives on the incident. Next, we have Mark McCormick, also a native of Wichita. Mark is a best-selling author, renowned journalist, public speaker, and he currently serves as the ACLU's Deputy Director of Strategic Initiatives. Like Victor, Mark lost several family members on that dreadful day in 1965 as well. Both Victor and Mark share kinship to the souls that perished at 2037 North Piatt, and I'll let them tell you more about that a little bit later. Ricardo is also a relative of both of these gentlemen as well. Lastly, we may be having Ed Andrews, and we may not. He was having some technical difficulties, so if he chimes back in, we definitely want him to add his perspectives. So I'll give his introduction. He hails from Tennessee, currently resides in Georgia, but he's relocating to Dallas. But we consider him a Wichitan at heart by way of service at McConnell Air Force Base and by way of marriage to his beautiful wife, Rose, of Wichita, Kansas. Ed is the first Black flight instructor in the history of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and he holds several advanced flight distinctions, along with over 4,000 hours of flight. He's also a very, very successful entrepreneur. And so welcome and thanks to each of you for being here today. I did want to ask you one thing before we start the film, just to kind of get everybody a chance to know a little bit about who you are. So I do want to start with just a rapid fire question. And I have a question that I'd like Victor and Mark to answer. Then I have a separate question I'd like for you to answer, Ricardo, if that's okay. So whoever wants to jump in first, Mark or Victor, just what you know about the incident. What is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about this tragedy that took place in 1965?
I don't mind jumping in first. My first thought has always been my first thought. I had an image of my mother running from our house on Volusia, running down 19th Street toward the crash site. And I've always had this image in my head of her standing there at 19th and Piatt, looking down and just seeing that lake of fire where her mother's house used to be. That's sort of the enduring image that I had, and just how difficult it must have been to wrap your mind around a tragedy like that. To say nothing about, losing loved ones in that tragedy. But that's the enduring image that I have.
Thank you for sharing. That's very powerful. And you know, you mentioned that lake of flames. The reports were that those flames were 500 feet high. So that's definitely tragic. Thank you for sharing. Victor?
Myself, I have images of my grandmother just being in that awful situation, you know, wondering how they were reacting when the plane crashed, you know. And I found out later on my dad and one of my cousins had actually went over and spent the night that night over at grandma's house. Uh, not until later on that afternoon that later on that night, I actually found out that my dad and my cousin Clyde Holloway was in in the house when the plane crashed. And then, of course, I had a little cousin by the name of Tracy Randolph, who I held dear to me. She's about 5 years old at that time. You know, to be honest with you, I was 10 years old at the time, and I just couldn't fathom such a tragedy. Uh, I did eventually make it over to that area after the plane had crashed. And about that time I got there, they were pushing us even further back off of 19th and Piatt, because of the flames and the rescue vehicles from McConnell and the different fire trucks coming in. So basically, about that time, I was, called to come back uh, to the house, my house, over on Popular Street, which was 14th and Popular at the time. So I was very devastated because, like I said, normally my grandmother was known to be at work some Saturday mornings. And when you know, it was just a tragic situation overall for me. I was, like I said, 10 years old at the time, and I had a whole bunch of stuff going through my head. I had spent many a weekends over my grandmother's house, so I just couldn't fathom that they had perished in such a manner.
Okay. Thanks for sharing and being 10 years old and being able to talk about that today, and definitely takes some courage. So we appreciate you taking time out today, and we thank you for your tenacity and your courage as well, because it's not easy. It's not easy to exhibit those type of characteristics under those circumstances. Ricardo, worked on the film with me, and one of the interesting things that we discovered is Ricardo really didn't realize he had relatives involved in this, and started to realize that as we started doing research on the film. And I guess for you, Ricardo, what came to mind when we started digging in and you start realizing that it hit as close to home to you as it did?
It was surprising to me, growing up, we heard stories and we hear about Tracy. That's all I ever heard. And the family didn't talk about that. We didn't talk about the loss. It never came up at all. And so as we start unpacking this and start digging and learning, it kind of, I don't know the right word I'm looking for, but it made me feel a certain way. I wish I would have known. I wish I could have heard it from how were they from my dad. That would have been good to hear about their lives from his perspective. So
Thank you. Little follow-up question for you. Did digging into this, did it give you any type of closure, any type of healing, or I don't know, what kind of emotions did it give you? That's for you, Ricardo.
For me,
Uh,
I don't know about closure. I know that we have a wonderful family. I know that, and I've always known that. But seeing what the family has overcome and what the family has endured, and yet and still we're still functioning and still making a difference in our communities based on even after we've lost some things. So hearing these things, and my family that personally we've experienced loss, and so understanding that, but our family has been affected. Loss has affected our family, and we've overcome. So.
All right. And I think that's a good segue into starting the film. I think it's no secret to anybody watching that all of us are Black, and I think that's really the Black experience, man. Overcoming and doing better and passing a better baton than the one that we were handed, and continuing to elevate. And each of you gentlemen have done that, and so I appreciate you being an inspiration for the next generations to come. And we'll talk a little bit more about family dynamics after the film, because I think family dynamics is one of the things that have helped some of the families heal. I'm going to ask you each to talk about maybe what healing looks like to you as well. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and start the film. We like to present to everyone that's watching Silent Cries of Unborn Ghetto
Exploding tons of volatile fuel into neighboring homes. 7 crewmen and 23 persons, including an unborn infant on the ground, died immediately. But the crash demolished 11 homes and damaged 50 others. This then was the single greatest airplane disaster ever to hit the air capital.
Good morning, little schoolgirl. Good morning, little schoolgirl. Can I go home with you?
And ooh, that was Wichita's own Don and Bob with the classic hit, Good Morning, Little Schoolgirl. And good morning, Wichita, on this cool Saturday morning. It's 9:28 a.m. This is the magnificent Dick Smart, spinning and grinning at the mic and the stuff you like. Coming up, we've got more music on the way. But first, a shout out to those Wichita State Shockers hosting St. Louis today at 1 p.m. Good luck, Dave, the Rave stalwart, Kelly Pete, and Nate Bowman, chasing victory number 10. And here...
No more Mr. Nice.
Parker, 4-2. Are we clear for a left turn?
Left turn, climb on course. Stand by for handoff to Kansas City Radar 4.
Roger, 4-2. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Rag 4-2.
Raggy 4-2, you're cleared to tower. You're 7 northeast, cleared back to tower, clear to land. Or if you can, land municipal. What's your trouble, 4-2?
No more Mr. Nice. Come on, call 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
On Saturday, January 16th, 1965, Clifford and Sandra Walls resided at 2011 North Piatt in Wichita, Kansas. What you just experienced was a reimagination rather than a reenactment of what might have taken place inside their home on that day. The Walls' daughter, Marcia, was not yet born, but conceived and fortunate to be alive and living in Wichita, Kansas this very day. We spoke with Marcia and others who remember or who were impacted by this very tragic incident, an incident that occurred while Marcia was still in the womb.
She was pregnant with me.
But you were born in 65.
Yeah, I was born in 65. I was born in August. Only thing my mom was telling me is that my great-grandfather and my grandmother and my great-grandmother was on their way from Oswego, Kansas to come see her that day. And I guess by the time they got here, the plane had already crashed. She just said, it just was horrible because she could hear everybody burning up and she could smell the flesh, burning up.
Used to play with Lynette Woodard down the street. She played basketball. I was a cheerleader. But so Sonia House tells the story of this. So where that building is now, it was an empty lot. And it turned out to be the makeshift graveyard where they laid all the bodies.
All I can remember is just boom, this big explosion. Big explosion. I put my hands down on the ground. It felt like a dragon was breathing over me, right over my body.
Like artillery. I didn't know that until I was in the service. It was just a big boom.
Folks got in their cars, kids got on their bikes, and we rode that direction. By the time we got there, the fire department can start blocking people off and telling them they couldn't get so far into the...
There's my aunt's house, and she actually counted 67 steps from here to her house, the yellow house here at 2123 Piatt. And actually, I'm glad you're coming this way. It's another part of the story of how Sonia House, my aunt used to always tell us the story, which, you know, she said it felt like when she heard the crash, it felt like the world had ended, like it was hell on earth.
I was in 5 Acres, which was an institution for neglected and abused children. When I found out about it, my uncle came up there and told me, and he told me he was going to drive back here, and I asked him if I could go with him, and he told me no. And I asked him why not, and he said because there's no body. And I couldn't figure that out. I didn't know what that meant, no body. I just couldn't picture somebody evaporating in a crash or something. So it kind of messed me up for a while.
My aunt was here in this house on that day and cooking breakfast for my cousin, Timmy Walker, and my other cousin, Stanley House. And they were watching cartoons. And she said she heard the crash and she just thought, oh no, the world is ending. She just heard a big boom, and she said she could look out her window though, and she saw fire. She saw the ball of fire right over there, and they were running and screaming.
She had said that one of the engines from the plane was came into my mom. I guess it came into my mom's house, and it was by her headboard of her bed.
I was staying with my grandmother intermittently. The morning of the crash, I was actually over to my mother's house. When the crash happened, and all we seen was a ball of smoke from the location we were at. So we basically just kind of figured it was a Derby oil refinery that blew up, maybe.
I think you would probably hear that most of us were up watching cartoons that morning. It was a Saturday morning. You only had about 3 channels at that time. And so the cartoons was one of those things that was there. As a family of 7 boys and 2 girls, we didn't have any milk that morning. And so it was Bob's turn to go get the milk. Luckily, yes, we had grocery stores right down the street. You could run down the street and get that. But this time it was just something different that morning at about 9:30.
From your perspective or from your memory, kind of walk us through what happened that day and then walk us through kind of what happened to your brother.
We had a KC-135 that went down in our neighborhood, just 2 blocks down the street. The sound was deafening. It was just an explosion that we had never heard before. And then the smells, the smell of fuel, the smell of flesh, many of us said, because it was something that we had never smelled before, but we did smell the fuel, and from later we understood that was the smell of flesh. Knowing that lives were lost, and then wondering where was our brother? You know, we couldn't find him at all, and so that was a moment of despair for us. And so we all dressed as quickly as we could and tried to get down to the street as fast as we could. Of course, they were holding people back.
There was this white guy that was there. He came over and he helped me take that off because I had a T-shirt on underneath it. And he took me to St. Francis emergency room. I guess he thought I needed immediate help, but you know, when I think back on it over the years, my poor parents, you know, my brothers and all the people from the block, they were looking for me.
Oh yeah, all of that happened and they didn't know if you were okay or not. How bad were you injured?
think I had gotten some shrapnel in my left knee, scar still there, and a little bit of a scar still on my lower back. But I was just fortunate.
No major burns on your back, but your jacket burnt up.
Yeah, the jacket
So
burnt up.
jacket kind of protected you.
It did. Yeah, it protected me. It protected me. But I was just blessed that morning. And I want to say for all the people that lost people, during that incident, I feel, I have a lot of appreciation for the fact that you guys made it through that type of situation, because after I left that scene, I didn't get a chance to go back to that area for like weeks. So by the time I got back up there, all the stuff that was on the ground, they had cleaned up. But it was so eerie to walk back through there. I didn't go down there with anybody. Nobody was with me that morning. And what a disaster.
You saw the crater though. They said it's 15 feet deep.
Yeah, if I'd have stayed right there where I was looking at that plane, and if I hadn't have ran, or maybe if I'd have ran back the other way, I don't think I'd be here for sure.
My brother was going to the store and was in the vacant lot that was right behind Razuk's. So he was almost to the store, but he hadn't made it there yet. And his jacket, he had on a nylon windbreaker. We probably don't even wear those anymore, but he had on a nylon windbreaker, which began to melt on him as he was going to the store. So that was a time that was horrible, absolutely horrible. But then you also think of what happened after that. Some of the families, had trouble even burying their family because they just didn't have the funds to do that.
And I took off my normal path. I walked it many times before. For years, I've walked that up to Razuk's. And that morning, right at the corner of, I guess that would be 20th, I was on the east side of the street, that last house before the field, and there was a jet tanker coming down from Wichita State, kind of like coming down 21st Street. I knew what it was because at that time, I was into military hardware. I would put together fighter planes, F-105 Thunder Chiefs, Skyhawks, Mustangs, P-51 Mustangs.
How old were you?
I was 11.
And you understood those planes at that age?
I know those planes.
Okay.
My dad fought in World War II, so
okay.
I've been kind of programmed with that type of mentality.
Okay.
And as it was coming down the street, I looked up and I go, oh, there's a KC-135. So I stood there right where that house is on 20th on the east side. There's a fence that runs along through there. And I started warming my head.
When I grew up, it was a park there, so I never knew until after I got a little older, my mom told me what had happened.
Okay.
And it's really sad, but she did say that I guess the plane was trying to circle around to try to release a lot of fluid, the oil from there. Not oil, but the fluid from there. And it's sad that it happened.
And I looked up and it was getting lower, slower, and then it made a bank towards me, towards Piatt. And I knew what planes looked like when they were about to land, and this guy that didn't look right. And it got when I saw that bank, I took off running because it was coming down. Something just told me it's coming down. So I took off on a path. There used to be some trees that were along close to Piatt, and I used to go through that path all the time. So I took off and I was running, and I think I ran about 100 yards, but my body didn't feel right. It just felt kind of numb because I was scared to death.
East side street or the west side?
I was on the east side of the street.
East side street, okay.
Going north on Piatt.
Gotcha.
And so I started running through these trees, elm trees, and they were real small. They were taller than me, maybe about 12 feet. And as I took the last step, I looked up over my right shoulder, and that plane was banking down like this. So I was seeing the front of the plane and the underside of the plane.
How far away from it, maybe in yards?
It was right there.
So it was very close.
It was very close.
Okay,
it was coming down. It was almost, coming down at an angle, nose down almost. So I probably took another maybe 10 steps, maybe 8. And like I said, my dad fought in World War II, watched a lot of war movies, knew it when it was time to hit the dirt, as they call it. And just when I came back and looking up, I dove because I know it was getting ready to crash, and then it was just horrendous.
And my sister was walking toward my grandmother's house when the plane went down. And she said, it was interesting, I was preparing for this discussion, so I called her. And she said she got close enough to see all the fire and the flames. And she said, I've always been this kind of person, but I looked at it and I was numb. I had no reaction. She turned around and went back home. Started walking back home.
Not knowing that she had family members involved in it?
She knew. I mean, she was headed to her,
okay, gotcha,
to our grandmother's house.
And that Albert, the real was asking for his friend. Albert, family of my personal girlfriend. Right, all power. I read in a book that said the heat was so intense, they found one of them, the head blowed up and the other stomach blowed up. I couldn't believe that.
It wasn't until my mother was in her 60s or 70s that she opened up to me about what she saw. She said she ran down to the corner and all she saw was just a lake of fire, which was consistent with what I'd heard about the crash, that this was a tanker. And despite the fact that it tried to dump some fuel, as it banked and went left and went west, there was still a lot of fuel on that plane. And it was just a lake of fire.
31,000 gallons of fuel on it still when it crashed.
And she said that her mother's house was just gone. Just gone. And that was hard for me to hear because my mother was always such a kind and sweet person. Never known her to be cross with anybody. And to lose your mom that way, it's just, kind of hard.
It appears that he made an effort at the last minute to avoid buildings, or knowing he was going to crash, perhaps put the airplane into the vacant lot.
The Mayday call, they circled and they said, well, we don't want to crash at Wichita State. We don't want to crash at the locopedics. Remember, all the people with disabilities lived there at the time, and they surely didn't want to crash at the refinery and cause a bigger fire. So they made that decision in the air, and I'm like, God, how that must have really, been something for the pilot to know he was going to die, but he made that decision to crash in the area where he thought he would kill the least amount of people.
And they said that the pilot said he wanted to belly land, but he would have taken houses from 9th Street up to 21st. So he rode around and dropped fuel before he actually crashed.
I think the myths, because that will fester if people don't talk or have any answers. And so, I can find anything. There's nothing that I was able to find that says that the pilot, I talked to, his wife and so on and so forth, but there's nothing in the research period that would show, the pilot had some say-so in it. When that happens the way it does, rudder malfunction that way, the plane's gonna do what it's gonna do.
I've got about 4,000 hours of flight time, commercial rated ATP airline transport pilot. I'm a graduate of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University out of Daytona Beach, Florida. I began flying down there in 1972 after 6 years, enlisted time in the Air Force, and got a BS degree in aeronautical science, which is basically an educated pilot with all your flight ratings from private through instrument, multi-engine, CFI, certified flight instructor type ratings. ATP airline transport ratings, which is I call it the doctrine of flying license.
We had the opportunity to speak with a young man who asked not to be identified, but he was just 12 years old at the time of the accident, and he remembers so much narrative and so much exposure about how heroic the white pilots were that at 12 years old, he wanted to grow up and become a white pilot.
Well, there was no heroism there because from the time the malfunction occurred with the rudder controls, and like I say, instead of the aircraft doing a coordinated turn, it did a skid. So when the ailerons were working, but the rudders was not working, and so the airplane rolled and it skid.
Okay.
And so now with that problem, your aerodynamics, with the weight of all of that fuel, the aircraft had no option because now all of your wing levels, you've lost lift. So the air pilot has no control of getting that lift back except for rolling out and getting the airflow back over the wings. But at this juncture with that much bank and the rudder's not working, the aircraft is just aerodynamically going to nose down. They did not nose down intentionally. No pilot that close to the ground, 200-300 feet, would intentionally nose it down. So that was just by what's going to happen.
Okay.
They had no control of that.
Well, maybe the pilot did this on purpose, or maybe this happened simply because the pilot was heroic and wanted to save the plane and all of that. And I literally got an email a few months back from someone on the side of the family of the crew saying, "Hey, could we petition for a medal because we think that the pilot nosedived the plane to save more lives." And I said, well, the challenge with that is we don't have any evidence that happened. What we have is the Air Force saying that plane malfunctioned, the rudder malfunctioned specifically, and they tested that, and that's what crashed.
What happened was as it took off, shallow climb, and then it tried to do a shallow turn. And when they realized here, before that snap, because what you had is overpressure between the autopilot and the rudder, and the pilot dealing with the rudder. And so something broke. A cable broke, hydraulic line broke, whatever, a boat, any number of things broke. And now that airplane did a hard bank. And now you're done. You can't roll that airplane back over. You can't do this. That airplane, just based on the weight, that's why they were trying to dump fuel, but too little, too late. So at this point, gravity takes over. That's the whole idea of flying. We try to overcome gravity. Well, now gravity is in control now. So the airplane nose down and, the resulting accident.
I think we'd like to believe that, okay, he had something to do with it or he can shift that, but it's just like that. I mean, the plane takes off less than 3 minutes later. It's crashed. Right. But that was, then the other thing is, because of the community, it's crashed here on purpose. Right, so that's the other.
There's people that still believe that.
Still to this day, that it's there on purpose. Could have gone, closer to 13th and Pawnee. Could have, headed over here, 13th and Oliver, somewhere over here. No, but it's the same. Same backdrop of it really was an accident. No control over that. But because nobody's talking about it, there's no memorial. Nothing is said. Those rumors just get perpetuated. That stuff continues to happen. That's the danger. But when you don't talk about these things.
And speaking about myths, it's also important to talk about racial segregation and how the racial climate might have helped drive some of those myths. The same book, Jet Tanker Crash, Dr. Cotter mentions that the segregation index in Wichita was 95% at the time, making Wichita, Kansas, the third or fourth most segregated city in America at the time. This played a huge role in the malicious myth that the plane chose its point of impact in order to kill black people instead of white people. Though very false, very justifiable beliefs based off the racial climate of the time. Control, dense, oppressed population, an area that Dr. Cotter goes on to say wasn't in the mainstream of American life. How many houses did it take out?
Here to down that house down there.
Oh, y'all on the other side.
Yeah.
Pretty much everywhere where this park.
Yeah. He came in at an angle like that, and all the fuel rests like that.
Wow. And it was a tanker.
So KC-130. Yeah, pouring out a whole lot of fuel for. They said he was over by WSU and white folks. That's when it's all white neighborhood then. Told him to get away from that.
They say he was trying to get back to McConnell Air Force Base. Well, this is a black neighborhood. Right across 21st and Grove was a white neighborhood. I don't know. I don't know how's that. I mean, how do you just not see those different fields? A lot of these fields and stuff weren't. Their houses that are there now. There were about Coke industry and stuff like that. There's been fields out there. I mean, it could have been any one of those fields that he could have probably crashed in. But I guess. I mean, I don't know. How do you pick this neighborhood? How do you figure that this would be a good spot? They say he was looking for a field. I mean, there couldn't have been much of a field because there's the Rizooks right there at 21st Street, and this is where it crashed, and these were all houses here. So he wouldn't have been, I mean, that myth of looking for a field, I mean, what field was you gonna put a KC 135 tanker, fuel tanker down in right there? How could you put it wasn't that big a field. So it doesn't make any sense that they said he was doing his best to get, find a field. If he could have found a field, Wichita State football field is right there. You could have crashed it right in the football field.
When trying to come back, like they were in a left turn, appeared to have lost altitude and then reported that they had a problem, called a mayday, and they ended up crashing around 20th and Piatt. From the air traffic control side, our point of view, that aircraft 7 to 8 miles from McConnell Air Force Base, they would have actually been able to more than likely see the aircraft, and they would have still been able to see him going down and would have probably witnessed the crash as it was occurring.
There was no environmental study, right? But there was a dissecting of that plane. So the Air Force was really diligent in getting every piece of wreckage that they could to not only reassemble 135's engines, but also to dive into, okay, what happened here? Because we simply don't know. So at the time, they did dive into that and they did look at it. And ultimately what they found was there was a rudder malfunction. Now, the rudder, of course, steers the plane. And that was the end result. When I petitioned the Air Force through FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, I got the report back. The former facility that held the archives burned to the ground. So, those files were missing for years. I was able to get that report, and that's what they found. That's what they labeled it as, was this rudder malfunction, which put the plane into what's called a yaw condition, yaw state, and then it crashed immediately.
A U-turn, and they were mixed stories on where they were really trying to go. Anywhere from Jabbar Airport to Mid-Continent Airport. From what I found out, they radioed and told them to make it to the nearest runway they could make it to, and they couldn't. So they did a nosedive in the field straight down to save population in the northeast part of town, which I felt like that was commendable for the pilot,
Good.
Instead of trying to land the plane, he knew he couldn't land it, so he just nosedived. And I can just remember people talking about it was basically a white crew, so, they were very aware of what part of the town they were in, which was basically black.
Gotcha.
And I've always wondered how come they couldn't have just crashed it in the field north of the Locopedic,
Back in 1965, this is before they had the installation of a black box. And what a black box is a black box is a recording device that is inside the cockpit. And what it does basically is it records everything that is said between the pilots and also everything that goes on with the aircraft, like why an instrument may be malfunctioning or failing. But basically, it's used for actually recording the conversations between the pilots. So nowadays, something like that happens, you'll hear that they're always searching for the black box after an accident.
The flight's less than 3 minutes. You don't have time to make those corrections. You don't have time to think about it and say, is this a black neighborhood? Is this a white neighborhood? You don't have that kind of time. So ultimately, that plane crash was a result of that malfunction. as I also described in the book, the plane had issues. It was called Raggy 42 for a reason. The plane was raggedy. It had all kind of mechanical challenges. It was never supposed to be in McConnell. It was there.
Some of those challenges were reported by the pilot, right?
Yeah, the pilot, they described it. Said, hey, these things are not, even in prior flights, these things are not acting correct. There's some challenges with this plane. So, yeah, by all means, the Air Force did make a definitive statement as to why it happened with the rudder. But there was no definitive statement to the families or to the community. So all we have is rumors, myths that perpetuated throughout time.
Share with you some documents. I shared with you some reports from Captain Schmuck, the pilot who was actually flying the flight on that day. Some reports 4 days prior to the crash, and also kind of maintenance log of that plane in particular. What were your thoughts when you looked at those documents?
Well, the first thing I noticed, the fact that doing pre-flight inspection, making sure everything is working correctly, he stated that the rudders would only move 3 to 4 inches to the right or to the left. So you had some restriction there. That's an automatic grounding issue. This aircraft will not fly because you have to have full rudder deflection control that size aircraft. So there was something broken in there or disconnected or wedged in there, a broken bolt, or who knows. But that's a grounding problem. So how they allowed it to fly with that's senseless to me. It's unacceptable. I mean, that's why we do a write-up, and they call it a yellow sheet, where you write up a defect, grounding issues, because you're talking about safety. You can replace an aircraft, but you can't replace a life. And so when you write something up and says it's defective, I don't care who has to pay, whether Boeing has to pay or the Air Force has to pay. They spend a lot of money training pilots. They spend a lot of money buying aircrafts. And so you just can't be arguing, I call it nickel and diamond, about what the contract says, whatever. Fix the airplane and fight about the money later. Well, let's talk about the rudder for a minute. And the aircraft operates around axis, 3 axes. You pitch, you got your axis, that's your nose to tail from here to here. You're operating around your longitudinal axis. And for your yaw, you got your vertical axis. Just imagine a line going up to down, and you're coming around here. And so that's why, like I say, to get a coordinated turn, you're combining your ailerons and your rudder. And so you're operating around 2 axes to maneuver the aircraft in a coordinated maneuver. And so everything have to be in a coordinated operation to work. Otherwise, like I said, skidded, nose down, lost a lift, and they crash. No one can even imagine that someone would intentionally do that. So why that theory or hypothesis or whatever you want to call it would come about. Nobody wants to kill themselves. The rudder, it has to deflect enough to kick the tail around. And so if you got lack from this report, lack of rudder control, you're not going to get a coordinated turn. And now you're just compounding the problem.
In addition to the rumor of the intentional nosedive, there was the statement released by the General Counsel of Boeing that blamed this entirely on pilot error, which was totally not the case, and the Boeing company later recanted that statement. Another rumor, as addressed by the book Mayday over Wichita by Dr. David Carter, is the rumor of the drogue chute, which likely stems from a chute discovered in one of the engines. Of course, the evidence suggests a high unlikelihood of a nylon cord causing the spiraling disaster. General Bywater, who was handling the investigation for the Air Force, called this rumor foolish. Going on reading from Dr. Carter's book, he talks about an escape hatch, which investigators later discovered to had been jettisoned at approximately 400 feet in altitude, suggesting that at least one of the airmen tried to make a last-ditch effort to escape, quickly also dissolving the parachute rumor. One of the study participants who asked not to be identified mentioned that that gentleman's body was found in the backyard, too mutilated for identification. An Air Force Base spokesman from Tinker Air Force Base went on record saying that the chute likely was caught into the engine after the crash, not before.
One way to understand racial redlining is to think about an essay written on a standard sheet of notebook paper. And now imagine trying to read the essay with the words minimized and cramped into the margins of the paper. Suddenly, it becomes hard to read and loses its purpose, right? Well, redlining is just that, pushing people into the margins of society and minimizing their value and their purpose as American citizens.
Hey, watch it.
Then, sucking the resources out of that marginalized community, making it overpopulated, crowded, and without resources. Finally, to add insult to injury, systematically manufacture health and wellness disparities by putting these congested neighborhoods near hazardous industries like oil refineries, metal fabricators, meat packing facilities, and train yards. Now watch the creation of all types of great things take place on the outside of the margins, like infrastructures, highways, jobs, fresh produce, and home ownership. Finally, the area that you live in is deemed undesirable, limiting your ability to get a home loan, which leads to wealth gaps, educational inequality, healthcare disparities, and voila, there you have it. Redlining 101.
Now, the word ghetto is a word that sparks a little controversy, a little tension. So it's important that we define the word ghetto for a film entitled The Silent Cries of Unborn Ghetto Children.
So the word ghetto starts in Venice.
March 29th, 1516, the northern edge of the island where Venetian Jews were pretty much enclosed and locked in at sunset. By some accounts, this cruel example of legally enforced segregation birthed the link between segregation and the word ghetto.
Well, in the 60s, it was still pretty segregated. I remember when we moved out where we lived at, there were several white neighbors. In about a year's time, they all vanished.
Okay.
Our schools were basically black schools with one or two, or probably less than 5 white families in the schools. I went to Isley in elementary school, and it was very few white kids in the school.
This ugly and degrading word ghetto has since become a euphemism synonymous with America's inner city, predominantly black neighborhoods. To the uninitiated, thoughts of poverty, crime, and rundown housing immediately come to mind. But for those birthed within these communities, there is a language, a culture, and a pride that embodies a calming reassurance that exists nowhere else in the world. Therefore, our neighborhoods are not ghettos at all.
From my sister's generation, people who were a little older than us, Reuben Eccles, Benita Gooch. They talked about the black community here, not as a ghetto. It's this really warm place to grow up in which they were surrounded by hatred. But I remember Benita saying particularly, she was always afraid to leave the community because she felt so loved here. The community that was so cold, they wouldn't even look in on people after a plane fell out of the sky and killed all these people. That was the ghetto.
Yeah.
Because I think about a place where people are capable of that kind of cruelty. It's like something you'd see on The Wire or The Shield. That's the ghetto. That's where all the immoral behavior.
Meanwhile, some black Americans have reclaimed the word ghetto and use it in a way that better embodies the richness, the soulfulness, the pride, and the beauty of that thing that we call blackness. Whereas other black Americans reject it altogether. I simply say this: These are the neighborhoods that produced your jazz, your blues, your country and western, your rock and roll, your hip hop, your blood transfusions, your traffic lights, your open heart surgeries, and on and on and on. So I simply say this: whether you like the term ghetto or not, we like to say, you're welcome, America.
Families were close, neighbors were close. That was the time when you could borrow a cup of sugar and feel that it was okay to borrow a cup of sugar. And so you knew everybody up and down the street. You had the kids that all played together. Even on behind us, of course, was an alley. So we knew the people on the other side of the alley as well. In 1965, we still had grocery stores in our community. We were able to walk to the stores in our community, and we had other businesses along the way, along 21st Street. So that was a plus for us.
60s, man, we had just kind of moved from a concentrated area down in the Wabash and Indiana area. And we had branched out, but we were concentrated. We couldn't go too far. We couldn't go past Hillside, and at that time it was like 25th Street. We couldn't venture past those areas much, but it was just a different time. We came from an area where blacks owned things, like we all businesses and what have you before that time. But after that time, integration brought about. We thought it was going to bring about a positive change, but actually it turned out to be somewhat negative because we lost all the businesses.
I did not grow up with one person that did not have a father in the home. Now I'm talking my generation. Now my daughter's generation is different, but in my generation, there was a black father in the home, which is why I was so ostracized being pregnant and not married. I mean, we had dinner every day when Dad came home. You dressed for dinner. I don't mean dressed up, but you didn't come in your robe to breakfast. Almost 80 years old and functioning and self-sufficient and still leading groups and still leading, and I think that all came from the love that I got as a little girl.
I mean, it used to be bowling alleys, restaurants, the only thing that remained were liquor stores. They allowed us to own liquor stores, but basically all the rest of the black businesses kind of evaporated.
I don't know if I would. I think my colleagues, they actually think I live in the ghetto. They do. And the definition, because I know you got a real good definition of ghetto.
I think I have a definition and I have a perspective, and so.
But I don't. I think we live in. I wouldn't call this a ghetto,
okay,
quote unquote. But I do call it one of the oldest African American communities in the city of Wichita that deserves more than what they've received, and not just be a deposit for their businesses.
From the soothing authenticity in Aretha's raspy delivery of the lyrics living in a world of ghetto life, to Curtis Mayfield's sermonic falsetto crying out the words ghetto child running wild, one would have to agree that whether you embrace the word ghetto or not, the heart, soul, and spirit of this nation is driven by black lives, black communities, black voices, and black stories. Still, segregation does not come without consequence.
Yeah.
Okay, without paying much of anything, let's just call it what it is. I think that's I think that speaks to the racism. I think if this was a white neighborhood, there would have been more accountability. There may have been more affluent family members who could have gotten better attorneys.
That's it. When you have the resources, when you've got the families in power, you tend to recover better.
But there was a coldness about the kind of segregation we had here. This was the kind of segregation that was like, we don't care how big you get, we don't want to live next to you. There's a whole story about how a white family purchased Chester Lewis's home and then deeded it over to him. It's the same kind of thing. Charlie McAfee will tell you, people shot out the window of his daughter's bedroom window when he moved in the, I think it's Crestview neighborhood. That's barbaric.
As long as you stay within those boundaries, but if you try to go outside those boundaries, it was a little difficult. I remember a couple of cases where purchasing houses was done by a white friend, and they would turn over the title and deed to the property after the house was built or after they purchased the house. And still then there were cross burnings and what have you when you accomplished that.
I remember going to a drugstore on 21st Street, and we had to walk around to the back, to the water fountain, and then come in. They had 2 stools at the end of the counter for blacks. That was all they had. And I asked my mom, how come we can't sit over there? So that's for whites only. And then I was talking to her. Some white guy came in and said, would you niggers get out of my way? Just like that. My mother grabbed me right then and there and took me out, took me home.
How did that make you feel?
Well, I mean, I was probably 6 years old when that happened.
You know, Joe Brown, who is my hero, came to North when I was a senior and talked about how because of segregation and racism, black kids only swam on Fridays. Because I gave the people enough time to drain the pool, clean it, and refill it so that white kids wouldn't swim in the same water.
I mean, what was bad for me all my life and still to this point was they look at me and see one thing and hear something different.
We still drink fire.
He told me,
Man, so he says, man, I thought you was black.
but no, I mean, growing up, I grew up in institutions, and to me it was even worse than theirs, you know, but I got called white boy, half-breed, wannabe, all this all my life, you know, which you can imagine I got in a lot of fights, a lot of, but it was just, I don't know, man, you know, it's like I in my heart I was black because that's who my black side of my family took me, so I was raised black.
A classic hit. Good morning, little schoolgirl, and good morning, Wichita, on this cool Saturday morning. It's 9:28 a.m. This is the magnificent Dick Smart, spinning and grinning.
Came from an area where black.
Who is my hero.
About racism. So when we got here, although it wasn't as bad, we still, I remember going to the Orpheum Theater and having to go and set up in the balcony because we couldn't sit in the bottom part.
You know, Mama Karen Casey. I interviewed her for a playbill. And she was explaining to me that when they went downtown, she saw Klansmen in their outfits. Just imagine how terrifying that must be to a child. But she would see them downtown. There was a large Klan contingent, not just here in Wichita, but in the state. So, in a respect, their community was a refuge where the teachers loved them, the parents loved them, the Sunday school teacher loved them. It was just venturing out beyond. One of the cardinal sins in journalism is filing a one-source story or attempting to file a one-source story. You gotta have multiple sources. Any editor worth his or her salt is going to see a story with one source, kick it back. In American journalism, however, we've had essentially one source stories about Black people in mainstream media as it pertains to not talking to African Americans about what is happening to them and in their communities. There was a time in this country where white newspapers would not even run obituaries of Black people. So if you had a loved one die, that was in the church bulletin. It wasn't in the mainstream paper. And it wasn't until, the tumult of the 60s that Black journalists began making inroads from Black newspapers into mainstream newspapers.
To Mr. McCormick's point, even the local newspaper in Wichita may have been a little biased in 1965. On the left, we see a list of names, ages, and addresses of some of the Black crash victims, but no information that really speaks to real humans who lived real lives. In the right column, on the exact same page, we see the obituary of a white man painted in a manner that depicts a human being, service to his nation, years of employment, loving husband, church affiliation, and so forth.
Air quality was poor.
Air quality
because the smells of the packing house, the meat packing house, filtered over into the community every single day. My mom, my brothers and sisters used to laugh because I always felt if I put on lip gloss, that smell was going to get on my lip gloss, and I would lick my lips, and I would be ingesting that smell.
Community. And when you think about it, the environmental racism, I like that term because your proximity to these roadways leads to kids having greater instances of asthma and other lung-related ailments. The air quality is worse, as you pointed out. Not to mention that your community is being destroyed.
The air in this area was terrible. It was, if it wasn't stinking with animal feces, animal carcasses from the stockyards, it was the Derby oil refineries right there at 21st and Hydraulic. So we lived a block away from the Derby oil refinery, one of the biggest oil refineries, and all day long, 24/7, it spewed gases and smelled like gas. It smelled like strong gas over this neighborhood all the time. So we were breathing that stuff in as kids. And I'm sure there had to be some type of contamination of water in the ground because of and then there would be pools. We used to walk down farther in the north, and there would be pools of just sludge, looked like nothing but a pool of just sludge, oil, or something like that. I don't know what that was, a spill off or what it was.
We came from the west side, and the west side was over where TCAM is today, the Kansas African American Museum. That was where we lived, along the railroad tracks there. No front yard, all dust, train tracks, train runs right down the middle of the community. That was where we lived. I still had a big mama on that side of town, and it was called the West Side. But then business downtown began to pick up, and we were in the way.
At the time of the crash, I was in the 8th grade, I believe. The boundary line shifted. I went to Mathewson in the 7th grade, and in the 8th grade, 9th grade, I went to Brooks. Well, that was from basically an all-black school. Like I said, it was similar. Mathewson was similar to Isley. It was just very few white kids that went there, to a shift of going to Brooks where there were very few black kids. But we came in and they just kind of dumped us over there. It was kind of traumatic for me.
But that was happening. One of the stories that this reminds me of is there was a Mac Adams golf club. And decades and decades and decades of black men playing golf. Well, when 635, I'm sorry. That's the Kansas City in me coming out. When 135 came through there, they said they had to stop playing 18 holes and play 9. It just bisected the community.
What happened? How did?
Well, you know, it was a slow migration. I'm not sure how it all happened, but I think when they started building downtown area up, and so they kind of moved us probably to the north. There also was the North End out here, way out here on the 21st. And if you turn right, if you'd have kept going off of Hydraulic, you would run into what they call the North End. That was like a poor black land. You know.
Even today, there's some thought about what we ought to try and do to try and deal with these old issues. But you had segregation, you had the highway being run through the middle of the black community. Then you had a lot of people, because of segregation, jammed into this smaller area, which, according to the book Mayday over Wichita, increased the body count.
How sweet to hold a newborn baby and feel the joy and pride it brings. But greater still, the calm assurance that child can face uncertain days because he lives. These are some of the lyrics to the Christian hymn, Because He Lives. I was asked to play this song at the funeral of Sandra K. Walls, who, during the time of the crash, resided at 2011 North Piatt with husband Clifford and unborn child Marcia, who was born later that year. This funeral was in February 2015, 50 years after the tragic incident took place. Unfortunately, just 50 yards away at 2041 North Piatt, expectant mother Laverne Wormsley and her unborn child would never experience living the words to this song. In a sea of flames, compared by firefighters to hell itself, the blended family, who also included husband Emmett Wormsley Sr., 12-year-old Emmett Jr., and 8 and 6-year-old Julia and Julius Malloy. What should have been a typical Saturday morning in a racially segregated city was quickly desegregated by a slew of white reporters, civic workers, military brass, and onlookers. Based on the racial environment of Wichita at the time and the minimal follow-up after the accident, one can't help but wonder which was more significant to white Wichita, meaningful black lives, or the sensationalism of the story. Something to think about. Deeper still, a black community traumatized by racism and now by its very heart and soul literally burning in flames was even spiritually segregating. 50 years after the incident, Wall's family was able to choose who gave remarks, who prayed, and who played because he lives in a service at North Heights Christian Church. In 1965, the Air Force brought in a 29-year-old white Catholic priest to pray final rites over the deceased bodies who weren't given that choice on January 16th. Despite several black pastors near the scene and on the scene that entire day. Think about it. 50 yards saved lives for Walls, and 50 years brought about social change that would enable her to experience equality and social justice that 25-year-old Wormsley could have only dreamed of.
This is 2038 North Hydraulic. This is where us, the Love family, was living.
I lived on 2038 Hydraulic, and it happened in 20th and Piatt, right? So it's just down the street.
I thought this yard was really big, and it's not that big right now, just looking at it. But this is the house that we grew up in, and back in 1965, when it was an early morning, and when the cartoon was on, we was arguing about the cartoons, which one we wanted to watch, and everything, and we was up in this room right here.
My dad jumped out of bed and said, "It's Russia, it's Russia."
Mama was cooking down here in the kitchen right here. And then all of a sudden, all the windows blew out. Just a loud noise and all the windows blew out. And everybody was screaming and hollering, and my daddy thought the Russians had came. He said, here come the Russians.
It was surreal. It was surreal. If you look at it, it would look normal, but you think about it, it's not normal to see someone burning in a car.
In the end, 7 crew and 22 people on the ground were killed.
Uncomfortable. Was it ever any trauma associated with feeling like you don't belong here and that you're not welcome there and that you can't eat here? Did that feel?
Well, I don't remember when it was that we were allowed to, if we went to the movies, to sit on the main floor. We had to sit in the balcony.
Curious, have we overcome the trauma of segregation? Have we healed from the trauma of the plane crash? Or are we still healing from both?
We're still healing from both. We're still healing. You know, when I went into council, I had a part of our district that I really wanted to do something, but I didn't know how. And so we surveyed that part of our community. It is between 9th Street and 13th Street. It is between Grove and probably Hillside. But there was a small section in there that we walked and we talked to all of the houses and the people that were in the community. That was a community, and the people told me, we thought the city forgot we lived here. That hurt me to my core. We thought the city forgot we lived here. And that was because it was all Black.
As far as being traumatized, those experiences, they last, they live with you forever. I'll never forget them. It's kind of hard to explain how those kind of conditions affect you. They affect you in a way that you feel ostracized, you feel like you're not accepted, and you fight against it.
Reverend Dr. Michael Waters was talking about redlining, and he made the comment that you look anywhere in America, redlined areas are either today the most gentrified part of that city or still poor. Wichita's no different.
When we moved from Cleveland to Piatt, we were the first Black family. I remember that. And I also remember white flight then.
Okay.
When we moved on Piatt, I remember that.
There were just a few white families remaining, but even knocking on their door, they didn't let you in, you said, huh?
Wouldn't let us in. And my mother was, please, please, as my daughter's praying.
I ended up working at Boeing, working on the same type of aircraft. And they were just out there laughing about the crash, you know, and I was down in the boom area of the aircraft, and I just happened to overhear them.
It's not a laughing matter, though, even if they didn't know you.
Not laughing matter.
Not at all.
To me.
So
they killed my family.
Right.
My mother, my grandmother, 2 cousins, and his father, plus all the friends we had in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I do think there's always been an attack on Black families, and I do recognize it and realize it in our situation. I believe a white family would have been treated differently.
I remember growing up, you could smell the meat packing plant from my house, and we lived on 21st and Old Manor, so that's 2.5 miles away. You could smell that there, so I can't imagine what it was like for folks living over there. But actually, I can. My uncle lived over there off of 23rd and Piatt, so we could smell that when I went over there to see him. And then you had your railway, so Union Pacific had what KDHE just kind of put out, and we're pushing this now. Back in the 70s or 80s, there was groundwater and soil contamination. So one of the degreasing chemicals that they used spilled into the ground, contaminated the ground on the 3-mile route from 29th Street north down to Murdoch along the Grove corridor. That impacted over 4,000 people. And it's still impacting them today because the groundwater is still contaminated. So
I was 18 years old. I was in my bedroom and I hear this rumbling. And in my mind, I thought, oh, Daddy's burning up something in the garage. And then this big crash came in and all my windows crashed in on my bed. And my parents were screaming my name through the door. My door was on fire. I had to jump fire to get to them, and we actually formed a human chain.
The smelling the jet fuel and seeing burnt bodies, we were exposed to it. They tried to cover it up, but I remember vividly when they triage units set up. And as kids, you know, we were nosy, we wanted to see, so we were getting in places where we could see. And I remember seeing them come down with several stretchers. And as we watched them, a body part might come out from underneath the blanket, burnt to a crisp. And that was kind of traumatic.
I'm in pajamas, bare feet, 8 months pregnant, and we're running for our lives. And I cut my foot on the wing of the plane because we had to crawl part of the wing to just get out of the backyard. When I turned around, I actually thought it was Judgment Day because I saw birds falling out of the sky.
I was alcoholic by the age of 12. So, I mean, I started drinking like that. That was about right after the plane crash happened. But, you know, you sit back and wonder if you had folks in your life, you know, that could have helped discipline you, would you have turned out that way?
We saw nothing but a big old thing of fire and smoke going out this way over here. And so my daddy did and said, hey, we need to get up and go see if something bad had happened. We need to go try to help somebody. So back here was a field. We owned this whole lot all the way back to Kansas Street back here. And Barry Sanders' grandfather and grandmother and them lived that lot right there. And so we all took off running, and we took off straight through here. And we ran around to 20th Street, and when we saw 20th Street, we seen nothing but fire, just fire everywhere, fire coming down the street. And what it was like gasoline coming down the street. I remember it was green. It was kind of like green gasoline, and it was on fire. It was just coming down the street. Just weirdest thing I'd ever seen. And, so we kept running down that way, and when we got there, all we could see was just everything on fire. And all my friends, a lot of my friends' houses were on fire.
We got to the black family, I can't think of their name, and that's how we realized my foot was cut. She gave me some socks. And she gave my dad a cup of coffee in a saucer, and he was trembling so he couldn't drink the coffee. They had to call 911 for him because what hit him when he opened the door was the pilot's head with his helmet still on.
The pilot's head actually hit your father?
When he opened the door, and we did like that, and it knocked him back. They found when the fire department came, it was January, so everything was frozen in the basement. So they found that head in the helmet.
Head disjointed from the body.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up without a father, grew up without a family. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but it was tragic for me because, you know, like I said, I never had a family. So, and every family atmosphere I found myself in rejected me. So, to this day, man, you know, I don't believe in family, but I just know, man, that I don't know anything about him. You know, I don't know what he looked like, nothing. So, yeah, it's been real rough on me, and it still is.
Now, when did you find out more about your father? About what age were you?
57.
So you were an adult, a full adult, okay.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about him. Didn't know anybody who could put me in contact with him or tell me anything about him. I didn't find out anything about my dad until I talked to Victor.
What I gave you today, I've never given to anybody else.
Thank you so much.
About the glass on the bed and jumping through fire and cutting my foot on the wing of the plane and the head. That was very, very sad. That was a very sad time. It was so sad. And that may be the reason I don't even remember it, because that was scary. They were reaching for me through fire. I had to jump fire. 7 months pregnant, I'm jumping the fire and running, and glass all on the floor, and the phone cord going up, and the room was bright, ablaze, and yeah, that was traumatizing. And I may have just buried that.
So a lot of research has been done as of late looking at Holocaust survivors. And particularly when you look at the children of those survivors who didn't actually go through the incident, and whether or not they carry those same genes, whether or not they're impacted by it. And anecdotally, we could say that that does pass on to a different generation, which again speaks to this. If you didn't go through the incident, were you still impacted by it if your family went through it? And I think the answer is yes. So that trauma gets passed on. We know that. And I do think that is part of the DNA that gets carried on. You can't go through an incident like that and it not affect you in some way. So it's not just a plane crash and that's it. There was a lot happening in 1965. A lot still happening today. We would say that in 2023. But if we don't look at the context of what's taking place, then there's a lot of questions that are left unanswered. So questions, for example, why do all these black folks live in this neighborhood? There is a reason for that. Not just on the legal side, but also on racial segregation and why they were forced to be in the neighborhood. Okay, why was there no memorial? Why didn't we have any plaque, any place marker, anything else that would indicate that this tragedy happened for decades after? There's a reason for that. In that context, it actually matters. Why was there no EPA or environmental study done? What happens when you have tons and tons of jet fuel just land in a community like that? So, what happens? Are there any lingering effects of trauma with those residents in there? No studies are taken, nothing like that.
I think the biggest one is mental trauma, just thinking that nobody cares about you. You're forced to be in the area, you can't get loans, you can't get resources.
There's no care or concern after that. How are you doing? Do we get you placed some? The Air Force did set up what we call, and I know the term, a reparations office, to where they handed out very meager checks to the residents to get some food, some substance. But there was nothing long-term, as indicated in the settlement certainly didn't help for them. So you don't have anything relating to long-term health care. Nothing following up to say, hey, I really care about how you're doing and I want to make sure that you're okay a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now.
57 years from now.
57 years from now, which would be nice.
There are people that are still not okay, I believe.
They're not. It affected many people, not just in the physical domain, but certainly in the mental domain. You think about emotional health and how it may.
I don't know. I normally use the term hood when we talk about our community. That's our hood. For me, short for neighborhood. And that's just where we are. That's where we grew up. That's where our experiences are, the good and the bad. It's where you learn about the folks who don't want to see you succeed, the oppression, the lack of opportunity, but it's also where you find some commonality in your fellow brother or sister. You find that resilience. If you can survive there, and a lot of what we've been through, we're resilient enough to deal with the rest of what the world has to offer. But oftentimes, because of all the mental trauma and all the blows that we continue to take, we just don't believe it.
Like that. Right. You just want to talk to you about what happened. And then only through that, slowly, the ice begins to melt. And now we're starting to have somewhat of a conversation.
Challenges we've kind of run into is people saying, well, why you want to retell the story? It's already been told, but we're not telling the story. I think it's just an innate desire to be able to be heard and understood, but even beyond that, I think that empowerment gives us life to a certain degree.
Imagine if we could rewrite our whole lives. How would we title each chapter? What stories would be retold with a different narrative? These are questions to think about when considering lives hindered not just by the tragic incident, but by the social climate, insulting settlements, and lingering misery. Thus prompting the question, what must take place for a community to properly heal?
So the segregation for the most part had passed, but our parents and our grandparents, they had just come out of that. So they would tell stories about segregated water fountains, segregated bathrooms, segregated schools. But of course, those of us that were born in 66 forward, that was not our experience by the time we became conscious and aware of the world around us. But the sting of racism was still there. So everybody still knew their roles. Everybody still knew their parts. People had a place in society, every group, and you knew that group and be pretty much abided by that. And I think on both sides, I think African Americans, particularly Mississippi, but throughout the Deep South.
I didn't realize that I felt the residuals. I knew something was different. I knew that I was treated differently. And I shared in the past about how I remember being in the first grade in school, and the teacher assigning reading groups, right? So she's assigning reading groups. There's 3 different groups. There's the advanced group, there's a middle group, and then there's the low group. And immediately, I was placed in the low group. We didn't take a test, we didn't do anything, but I was placed in the low group, and I call it the pug group because the book was called Pug, and I remember it, and I was so mad because I felt I could read with anybody.
Black church has been the bedrock of the African American community. That was the only institution that we ever, from the very beginning of this, our presence in this country, the one thing that we had some sense of ownership of and then was the Black church. Black church was a place where we decided to focus on the education. It happened there. We decided to focus on voting rights and full citizens. It happened there. What the church was had changed. It began to change, and so the gospel or the message began to change to me. And when that message began to change, you started to see the impact of the church different. Church wasn't it was still the bedrock. It was still that, but it moved to the place of being Mary and Mary. Right? You get married, you get buried. This is what the church is for. Pastor, you talked about the voice. People, I learned my voice in the church. We learn leadership.
Come on.
That's where we learned how to organize. That's where we were taught how to vote. Every time there was an election, the Black pastors would come together, but something changed.
There's a separation. It's like, y'all don't know what y'all talking about. I don't care if you went to school. I don't care if you're educated. I don't care any of that stuff. You are not like us.
Black, white.
And there's still a divide. There's a divide. It's divide in church. People don't people don't talk about that, but there's a divide in church. They say Sunday is the most segregated day of the week.
Air Force sent in a priest. His name was Father Thomas Heffernan. He was 29 years old, and he was asked to pray final rites over these bodies. Now, meanwhile, there were several pastors from the community that were there helping people. None of them were asked. So these black bodies, these black preachers, I guess your prayers don't reach heaven. So we're going to bring in Father Thomas Heffernan. Now keep in mind, we have 30,000 gallons of jet fuel flowing through the street. And these preachers are out there ankle deep in jet fuel helping people. And nothing against this man, I'm just reporting what happened. Firefighters carried him on their backs out there so that he didn't have to get in all of that mess, so that he could pray over these victims who may have had a problem with Catholicism. They didn't ask them their faith. They didn't ask them, give them a choice or anything. They had this man come and pray on them. One of the reasons, Pastor Johnson, I asked you here today is because one of those pastors was the pastor who pastored the church that you're at the time, Everett Reynolds. Everett Reynolds lived 2 blocks away at 1831 North Piatt. Joseph E. Mason, who was the pastor of Calvary, resided at 1802 North Piatt. And then U.W. Barrett, who was the pastor of Tabernacle, lived at 2054 North Piatt, and he suffered some injuries and some damage to his home as well.
They were doing the work. And so what does the work look like? This work of this gospel. What does it look like? It look different for me every single day. And what can we do to help in our community? And that's what they did. Mm-hmm. They were dirty. They got dirty to help in the community. Whatever needed to be done. And then think about that. After that, think about the burials. Think about the funeral services that took place for the people who were killed in the crime.
And the trauma having both lived and pastored in that community where that trauma resides. Yeah. You go to the Black community and you see what looks like just poverty, mm-hmm. but it's more than poverty. It's unrealized, unrecognized, and unhealed trauma that's getting played out there. And the people now in this generation, they don't even know why they don't even know what the trauma. They don't even know that they're traumatized. They don't even know that they inherited that. They don't even know why it's there.
And they're acting out, but they're acting it out. They're acting it out. church was a place where everybody knew that somebody was in there to listen to. You know what I'm saying? But I think now, the church has to take on a whole different place and begin to acknowledge the whole mental health piece. There's a mental health component that we, it used to be, you don't go say that you're going to talk to somebody or everything like that. As a pastor, I can counsel, and I can counsel as far as I can. But there are people that are trained to help. Therapists who are trained to help people who go through trauma. And it's my heart that I'm showing to the people that I care, but God cares about where you are right now. You know? That one of the big
and there's no less of there's no less in devotion, there's no less of an authentic Christian experience than sitting in church and that prayer and processing everything in a nutshell. I'm saying it's no less, because what Black folks do very well is we embrace the fullness of what it means to be human. We don't have a choice. We don't have a choice. Like, we can't avoid our pain.
And so we end with a conversation on healing. But how do we heal from racial trauma, past and contemporary? And do we ever heal from tragedies such as the 1965 Piatt crash? How does a city that has been so marginalized produce the likes of Ron Walters, Lynette Woodard, Donald Hollowell, and M. Lee Pelton, not to mention countless teachers, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and successful entrepreneurs? Some have mentioned group meetings, others faith, and others therapy. However, the common sentiment is the resilience and drive that pushes us to continually make something from nothing. We talk about events like this to heal, give a voice to the voiceless, and to remind the next generation of what we have overcome. But like the newspaper clip earlier demonstrates, there was so much trouble learning about the lives of these individuals and who they really were. Gary Martin and his brother Joe Martin Jr. were the only two white civilian victims, but certainly their legacy at 2031 North Piatt was greater than this. Where are the stories of 25-year-old Joe Martin serving in Vietnam and returning home without a scratch, or 17-year-old Gary wrestling for Heights High School? At 2037 North Piatt, certainly the unlived legacy of 5-year-old Tracy Randolph was more meaningful than a mere one line in the paper. Why was there no mention of Clyde Holloway's military service? Thankful to Mark McCormick, Victor Daniels, and Claude Daniels Jr., we got to learn about Claude Daniels Sr. and his mother, Mary Daniels, but we couldn't find anything on Dewey Stevens, whose son Clyde is still searching for answers. At 2041 North Piatt, we have very little information about the entire blended family that was wiped completely out. Emmett Wormsby, 37, and wife Laverne, 25, along with children Emmett Jr., Julia Malloy, and Julius Malloy, ages 12, 8, and 6. We were, however, able to find this photo of Emmett Sr. and Emmett Jr. Then there's 2047 North Piatt, where we know that 34-year-old Delwood Coles was found in his car, melted completely down to the bones. But outside of that sensationalism, all we know is that he had recently moved here from Texas to work in the meatpacking industry. Why was it never reported that he served his country and even received a Purple Heart? At that same address, we don't know much of anything about 46-year-old Ernest Pierce Jr. either. At 2053, who was there to hear the silent cries of 22 and 24-year-old Albert and Wilma Bolden? And who sung lullabies the night before to 9-month-old Leslie Bolden, 6-year-old Denise Jackson, and 5-year-old Brenda Dunn? At 2059 North Piatt, Sharon Dale, now Watkins, had left the house, and her father was at work, only to find later that her mother Alice, 47, and 2-year-old sister Cheryl were gone, along with their home and all of its belonging. Miss Sharon shared that this event was too tragic to relive and opted not to participate in the film, but did share that the $38,000 reported settlement was a lie. And though she did not reveal the true settlement, she referred to that as a joke as well. Other family members of victims shared similar sentiments, referencing unfit temporary housing and larger settlements paid to utility companies for damaged infrastructure than what was paid to individuals and families for casualties and complete losses of everything. One final victim we didn't get a chance to learn much about was 22-year-old James Glover, who resided at 2101 North Piatt, where another home has since been built.
Haven't we gotten them to death in our community?
In our community.
I mean, because because of trauma, we're killing each other.
Our whole lives, we rewrite our whole lives. Can a man reflect lightly when reflections of light seem so distant at times? When I'm losing.
I'm muted, and I have Victor muted, and I have Mark muted, and I have Ricardo muted. Got you unmuted. I can't unmute you, Ricardo. You tried it. Okay, there we go. Everybody's unmuted. All right, so let's have a little conversation. I figured we'll stop it on the credits. I figured everybody didn't want to sit and watch the credits, right? First off, again, thank you to St. Mark United Methodist Church for allowing us to use their virtual platform, and also for inviting us to do a live showing, which we'll be announcing once we get the logistics worked out for that. So thanks again for serving the community and allowing us to be part of the services that you provide. I have some questions that I want to ask, but before I just jump into questions, I wanted to see if anyone out there wanted to shoot some questions to us. You can shoot them through Facebook, or you can shoot them through this platform. I'm not sure what it's called, StreamYard. I want to start with one of the comments that was made though earlier before we start showing the film. Rochelle Andrews had kind of echoed what you had said, Ricardo. She said we didn't talk about the loss, and I thought that was pretty powerful. And I was hoping that maybe the three of you could kind of speak on that. Why is it that it's almost treated like a secret when this type of devastation, like you said yourself, Ricardo, and several other people that I talked to, just something that they haven't talked about going on almost 60 years. So whoever wants to jump in, feel free.
Mark, go ahead. You mentioned in the movie you were talking about that your mom, she didn't talk about it till she was in her 60s or 70s. Can you talk about that?
About the reason why it wasn't discussed more?
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you think? I'm just curious to know. I mean, you grew up in the house with her, her and Laura Lee.
I would imagine that in our household, it had a lot to do with my mother's relationship with her mom, strained. But perhaps more than that, the loss of a child. That, losing anyone would be difficult. When you lose a child, somehow that grief reaches into your imagination about what this child might someday become. And it's sort of like in that Western, Unforgiven, where he's talking about how gunfighters take someone's life, how a gunfighter could take someone's life. And you don't just take their life, you just take away everything they'll ever be, everything they'll ever become. And the dimensions of that kind of grief, I just think was so powerful that no one could talk about it, but it was present every day in the household in the way that my aunt gravitated to every boy child in the family, but didn't want anything to do with little girls because she lost one. I suspect that had a lot to do with it. And if you talk to you know, some of our extended family. If you talk to our patriarch, you talk to Mr. Donnie.
Donnie, yeah, yeah.
He talked a lot about how that branch of my mother's family was very private to the point where they almost didn't communicate with others about things that were happening in their lives. So they were private people to begin with, and then you had this unimaginable, unspeakable tragedy. You know, hell opened up and then reached out and took this little girl. It's just too much. It was just too much, and I feel like people function based on what I was trying to figure out a nice way to say this. It's beyond someone's ability, I think, particularly in that era where mental health was such a stigma. You know, to face this, it was much easier to just close your eyes and just breathe through it until you were past it, sufficiently past it.
Thank you, Victor. I kind of want to piggyback off of some of the language that Mark said. Unimaginable, unspeakable trauma. And you experienced that at 10 years old. What, if any, impact did that have on you over the next 57, 58 years of your life?
Well, Mark kind of hit right on it. I think the most devastating part of the tragedy in our immediate family was my little cousin Tracy. I mean, I played with her. I spent the night with her. We walked back and forth to the store, rode bicycles together. I mean, she was the focus of my grandmother's house. Basically, when I went over to my grandmother's house, Tracy was there because my Aunt Laura Lee worked quite a bit. So that was a place where if you wanted to go see Tracy in her glorious years, that was the place you'd go. That little girl, I mean, she was everything to the family. And I can remember right after the plane crash, my aunt just kind of disappeared off the face of the earth. And Mark kind of hit it. She just disappeared. You know, I think she'd moved to Chicago, got married, and didn't hear anything about her for years. And it was just devastating. I mean, that's the tragedy I see myself from that plane crash. That little 5-year-old girl. I was 5 years older than she was, but she was just a sweetheart. My grandmother was a wonderful lady. You know, my dad was my dad. I'll leave it at that. But, you know, the white neighbors next door, you know, I'm glad you brought that up in this documentary because I can remember, you know, the family was pretty excited because the brother was coming home from the war. You know, I had met that brother at one time or another. I can't remember when and how, but that was something that just stuck in my mind. That white family and my little cousin.
Could I say one more word about Tracy, Kevin?
Please.
So at one point I had written about the plane crash in a column at the Eagle. And I got a call from Lynette Woodard, who remembered Tracy and said that she and Tracy used to play together through the fence and that they were good friends and that she had no idea that I had that connection to Tracy and that for a lot of people, she was the embodiment of the tragedy because the picture that you showed was kept in the window of a photography studio that catered to African Americans. So anybody who passed the shop where the photography was taking place saw that picture in a gallery of other, you know, studio shots. So it sort of became the epicenter of just how tragic this was, because she's such a darling little girl. And as I was saying earlier about, the tragedy of, we lose children, it's compounded.
Yeah, that is very powerful. You're right. You said something earlier about you can't help but spend the rest of your days wondering what was that person's life going to become. And it kind of piggybacks into something Victor said when he talked about the black-white issue. Wichita was very segregated at the time, but at the same time, we share in this thing that we call humanity. And that really was the overarching kind of question that guided us as we were trying to create this piece was, what does it mean to be more human? Part of that is healing. So I really want to ask, and any of the three of you can kind of talk about this based on the fact that all of your families were impacted and all of you have grown up somewhere in proximity of this community. How does a family heal from something like this? Segregation and this incident.
I think the first thing that in order to heal, you have to first acknowledge the pain. You can't heal from something if you don't acknowledge that there's pain that is there. It's kind of like someone, going to a doctor and saying, okay, I'm sick, but I need to go to the doctor and I can find out what's wrong. And the doctor's asking questions, what's wrong with you? What's going on? And you don't tell the doctor. Doctor asks, where does it hurt? Does it hurt here? You don't say anything. Does it hurt here? You don't say anything. But we do that, and then we expect the doctor to give us what we need to heal us, but we're not willing to open our mouth and say, hey, I'm hurting here. And we might not have we don't have the words to be able to say that. And talking about pain or hurt, it's almost, shameful somewhat, So don't say that. Don't tell nobody. You better dust it off and you keep going. But until we acknowledge the pain, there's no healing can take place at all. So.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, acknowledging the pain and so we talked about a community that kind of silenced the pain. You mentioned in your own family incidents of that. We talked to Marsha, who her mom was pregnant with her at the time, and now she lives in Wichita. She was born later that year. She talks about her mom never talked about it. I ran into people that didn't want to talk about it that I wanted to interview, and so I appreciate you saying acknowledging the pain. And you also talked about Ricardo being able to know what's wrong. I think sometimes when we're traumatized, we may not have the language. Sometimes we don't know what's going on. So I'm gonna throw this back at anyone who cares to speak to it. How do we find out what's wrong? Because I think a lot of us walk through life dealing with trauma, myself included. How do we find the language? How do we identify what our trauma is?
I've been thinking about your question, Kevin, for a few days, and what I've been thinking about mostly today is, there's not a single way to heal. We live in a society where we've made a choice that we're not going to extend healthcare to people who need it. So consequently, if you're injured and you don't have good coverage, you're going to heal. But, if you were like me, you broke your nose in college and, somebody said it, that's one thing. But what if you break your nose and it never gets set? You're just going to have a crooked nose. Or if you broke your arm or your leg and you had a compound fracture and it didn't heal properly, it's going to heal, but you're going to be limping, or you won't have full use of your arm. And to me, what we're talking about here, and what I think is the real power of this project, is that it lays bare the value proposition that Eddie Glaude talks about, that African Americans simply aren't valued the same. And when you're not valued the same and you don't have the same access to the kind of health care and mental health care that others have, you're going to heal, but it may heal in a grotesque way. And there's nothing to me more grotesque than denying people who really need health care. Even Dr. King said, of all the kinds of discrimination in healthcare is the most barbaric. But I was reading Glaude's book, Democracy in Black, and he has this scene where this woman who had worked really hard to keep her house in the middle of the housing bubble bursting, the people who evicted her showed up having made accommodations for her dog, but not for her, her daughter, or her grandchild. That's the value proposition that is played out over and over in this country, and that is played out in this documentary that you put together. That for whatever reason, I happen to think that racism was created to justify what we were doing in the slave trade. But for whatever reason, we just don't have that same kind of value. And these are the ways that this value proposition plays out. Like we just saw, in this video where people were killed and people were going through enormous grief. And people were still cutting corners on the food they gave them or the shelter they gave them or the kind of comfort that, they should have received from someone in the clergy. They chose someone outside their faith tradition. How thoughtless is that? It's just, to me, that's where the real power of your project shines through, because it lays bare something that the society still will not admit. Our Supreme Court basically said racism doesn't exist. You're all making this up. The irony is they're the ones living in a dream.
Wow.
Well, it's a nightmare for us.
Amen on that.
Wow.
Well, I got something else to say here too. Like I said, I've stated before, I've had some psychological problems from day one after that plane crash. I won't go into a lot of detail. My brothers, I've got several brothers, and we've all discussed this, the effect that it had on us coming up. We actually grew we became closer after this plane crash. I've got several half brothers. We're half brothers, but we all became a lot closer after this plane crash because our father was gone. We used to sit around and talk about what it would have been like if he would have still been alive, if we could have, basically been raised up around our grandmother. These kind of things. I've got cousins, Clyde Holloways. I his daughter. What would have been if these folks would have made it through this plane crash, didn't lose their life. I had some psychological, I had some behavioral problems. That's why I sit back and I let people know I ended up being addicted to alcohol, which, I've been off of it for years, but these kind of things you put in the back of your mind, is this a result from the plane crash? Could I turn out to be a little bit different person if I would have had some kind of psychiatric help at the time? Nobody ever, nowadays they have a shooting, you hear, oh, we're going to send counselors in. We didn't have any of that. We were traumatized and left to lick our own wounds. And that's the bottom line.
You said something interesting, Victor. Two people I talked to, one of them didn't want to be in the film, but she said it's okay if I quote her. Her name was Miss Dale, Sharon Dale. She was 15 at the time. And she said, Kevin, they didn't send anybody to talk to us. No psychologists, no doctors, nothing. Then we talked to Ricardo, and I had the pleasure of interviewing Miss Carolyn, who's in the film.
Yeah.
And she had mentioned something similar. She said the only person that wanted to see me was my doctor because I was pregnant. She said, but other than that, no one wanted to talk to me. My doctor said, "You're pregnant. You just went through this. Get in here right away." But she said, had she not been pregnant, no one would have spoken with her either. Yeah, that's kind of scary. And it kind of goes back to kind of some of the things Mark talked about, and I'll just pose it as a question: if this would have been College Hill, would it have been the same reaction? I don't know. Anyone want to speak to that? I think that the answer kind of speaks for itself, but I definitely want to hear some thoughts on that.
That's the value proposition. You know, those are folks that matter more. And we're going to care more. I mean, like, I'm not wishing anyone ill here, but I saw that the sports journalist, Erin Andrews, just got married, had a kid, and I remember her winning a $50 million settlement because someone saw her naked in her hotel room. $50 million. In my 5 years here at the ACLU, I've run across people who have been wrongfully convicted, who spent 30, 40 years in a prison for a crime they did not commit. And to this day, the state refuses to give them anything. One guy up here was given, I think, $1 million when he was, but not 50 like, you know, Erin Andrews. I mean, it's so obvious, this value proposition that we have in the culture. And it's always in conflict with this idea that, well, this is not who we are. Whenever we have some sort of ugly spasm of racism or violence, well, this is not who we are. Well, this is precisely who we are. And it's our inability to confront who we are and how we view people differently based on melanin content. That's really what we have to resolve. And it's a spiritual problem. It has a deep spiritual dimension. It's beyond something that we can intellectualize.
Wow. Victor, you know, just in conversations with you, you were very concerned about them putting a monument up there. And I know it probably took about 7 years to turn a vacant field into a park, and about another little over 40 to put a monument up there. And I don't know when they put the one at McConnell Air Force Base, but you had mentioned visiting that one as well. What hasn't happened that you would like to see happen?
Well, that's a good question. I'd really like to see them come in here and try to basically the families that's left here, offer them something, you know, not so much monetary, but some kind of explanation, or get us all together and say, this is what's happened, you know, and we can't do anything about it now, but, you know, the city can come in there and take over that park and really treat it like a park. You know, everything that's up there on the Piatt Park Memorial is basically was done by the citizens and the representatives of the city of Wichita, such as Olitha and all of the council members that was on the council when we got that erected. Now, I'm going to tell you, this is what happened with the base. Major Chris Witz, which his father was the co-pilot on the airplane, the captain. He raised so much hell, he got that memorial erected out there at McConnell. He actually started off trying to help us get one over there on the Piatt Street plane crash site. But the meetings he attended, the folks that was part of that meeting basically just kind of turned a blind ear to him because he was white, you know, he wasn't part of the family. He was only part of the crew. And I actually spent hours on the phone with this guy. You know, he had told me he wrote Washington and he got the funds just like that in a matter of months to have
Wow.
that memorial erected out there. And it goes back to what Mark's kind of mentioned. It's black and white. You know, he was a white guy. He got it done. We had a committee going on around here. We couldn't get anything. One of the reasons there was too much bickering, you know, amongst the organization at that time. And I would really like to see somebody, Air Force, I don't care who it is, somebody come in and say, we're going to take care of that park. We're going to keep it clean. We're going to make sure there's a fund set aside to make sure any damages that they'll take care of. We had some nice benches out there at one time. Somebody in the neighborhood came and destroyed those, you know, and the city didn't seem to care. You know, when they came and made it, I have nothing against Lynette Woodard, but they made that park Lynette Woodard Park before it became Piatt, the plane crash, KC-135 Piatt Park. You know, it seems like nobody really cared what happened. Even today in that neighborhood, very few people really know what actually happened there, unless they're descendants of people that lost their lives or stayed across the street, such as, you know.
Okay.
I'd like to see something like that done.
Yeah, you touched on a couple of things. One, you're right. You know, even the night we did the screening at the park. You know, we had requested some things from the city that were promised, that we paid for, like 7 trash cans that weren't there. The grass wasn't cut, so I made the assumption that, okay, we've got a lot of rain. Maybe they didn't get to this one, but I don't make assumptions without checking my assumptions. And my assumption was somewhat facetious to begin with. So I looked at some other parks. I won't name them, but the grass was cut at all those other parks. Those parks were clean. You were there. You saw how the condition the park was in when we came. They didn't offer me a refund for what I paid for the permit, but they didn't meet me halfway. Take a look at the monument. They haven't done a good job. That the bricks down there, those are beautiful bricks, but they need to be power washed. So you're 100% correct, man.
And parking, parking's the other thing. The other night we was there, you know, why do they have no parking there? That's a park, okay?
No parking all the way down the street. You're right.
Right there on what 20th Street, you couldn't park really on either side of the street. With no parking. I think you got a little bit of parking just west of there, right there at that hedgerow where the parks divides the other side of the other block there. You know, I think they could do a lot better than that as far as taking care. If it's going to be a park, treat it like a park. Call it a city park and take care of it.
No doubt.
Can I jump in, Kevin?
Please.
I just wanted to. I told Wakey this after I had a day to kind of reflect on what the evening was like, and I told Wakey and I told one of my other cousins that evening, surrounded by 200 people in lawn chairs, watching this event, I had never ever in my life felt that kind of community in my community. And there was something that Victor just said that triggered that memory, that people didn't know, people didn't understand the history. And I think that's a function of the kind of grievous injuries we've endured as African Americans. We've had our history and our culture amputated. And people with a healthy sense of self would need recognition from the larger community to establish our own monument, which is what we did. People in the community helped pay for it, but the degree to which we don't know and we're still hurt by these kinds of things, I think is a function of why this project is so important and why the two of you are so important as griots, as keepers of history, as people who, you know, the person who is the keeper of your history, that is everything. Your history, your culture. That's how we measure ourselves against the world. That's how we measure ourselves against what our aspirations are. It's a true sense of self. It's this kind of exercise that is really so important. And I think this is probably a turn in that healing process that you were asking about. The fact that two people from this community saw this story, revived it, and then shared it in a way so that people could process it. I mean, it's just a beautiful thing. And I think that's what I was feeling. And it's like everyone there felt like a family member, a close family member. I just don't remember that feeling once, even though I said in the piece, I was referencing when I referenced Reuben. When he was a child, throwing the paper, he'd go into a business, he'd say, "Oh, there's Reuben." And they'd hug him and they'd put him up on the counter and they'd give him a sandwich and they'd give him a soda and then they'd send him off, to do his next thing. That's the community that produced you and produced this film, and that has us, I think, on the right kind of trajectory.
Appreciate you so much. Appreciate all of you. We're a little bit over 2 hours, so I'm gonna have to bring it to a close. So I want to just share a little piece of information and then get any closing thoughts Ricardo might have. And definitely powerful discussion. Thank you for taking time out of your day. We had Mr. Ed Andrews, the master pilot who you saw in the film, but he was having some technical difficulties with the internet. But we will definitely do another virtual one in the future because we definitely want to get Ed included in some of these conversations. I just want to share something about the settlements, something that if I had to do all over again, we would touch more on in the film. But there were two types of settlements. There were the administrative settlements and there were the court settlements. The administrative settlements were the ones that were paid out from the government directly without having to go through the courts. And for an attorney that handled those particular settlements, there was a 10% cap on those. For the ones through the courts, it was a 20% cap. Then the law raised that to 25% by 67. But just give you an idea of these settlements, $640,000 of settlements filed, only $104,000 paid, plus another $9,000 in emergency payments. There was only one payment that was over $5,000 to an individual who lost his wife, his daughter, his house, and all its belongings. But there were 6 payments over $5,000 that were made. One to the gas company, one to the city of Wichita for damaged property, and 4 to insurance companies, just to kind of put in perspective that whole notion of what it means to be more human and what it means to be treated as less human, kind of like Mark spoke to. In addition to that, there was a gentleman by the name of Lorenzo Pouncil who was paid $1 from the from the Air Force for the damage to his property. His house, I don't know how much damage it was, but based on the fact that 25 feet from his house was another home that was reduced to ashes, I would imagine that $1 was an insult. He thought $1 was an insult. And so who am I to argue with that? Based on some of these other things that we found out, I'm sure it was an insult. There was also 5 other claims that were settled for a total, not $200 each, a total collectively. So about an average of $40 per settlement. The Eagle on August 5th, 1965 said money is not a sure cure for heartaches, but many of the surviving victims have had to go without funds while patching up their wounded bodies and homes. So I just wanted to end on that. And then if you had anything you wanted to share, Ricardo, please do. And I think St. Mark's ready to kick us off of their network.
I don't have anything to close. I think this was a great experience. I learned a lot. I think we all learned a lot. And I hope that we use this as an opportunity to heal and actually talk about the pain. And as we talk about the pain, be willing to share these stories. Share these stories. Share these experiences. The good, the bad, the ugly, the indifferent. All of those things. When we share that, then we can grow. And I want our community to be the best that it can be. I want it to be a good community. But we have to share and we have to communicate. So.
Awesome. Great closing words, as only a preacher can do. Appreciate you, my brothers, all 3 of you. Appreciate everyone who tuned in today. Also, Humanities Kansas, thanks for making this possible. And thank you so much to Pastor Yolanda and St. Mark United Methodist. We definitely look forward to sharing with you in person. They're going to host an event for us to show the film there. And we'll be posting for more viewings. We have several more in the works. So, come out and support us. We definitely would love to see you there. Thanks. And we're going to sign off.
Okay.
Appreciate you.